Well, we're going to finish up this week's conversation about spiritual qualifications, or marks of spiritual maturity, by talking about one that, again, I think is probably fairly relatable to all of us. For some people, it's a bigger issue than others, but it's the issue of greed. What Paul says is a man who is in spiritual leadership can't be a lover of money. The Greek word that's used here literally means having a love for silver, kind of a fondness of it. And it's kind of like the idea of the Midas story. The Greeks used to tell the Midas story. King Midas, who was so greedy that he desired that the gods would give him the power to turn things into gold, and they heard his prayer. The problem was everything he touched turned to gold. The food that he was going to eat, his family, his children, everything he touched turned to gold. And of course, how did King Midas die? He died of starvation because everything he touched turned to gold. It's a great parable. It's a great way of illustrating a fact of life that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, according to the Apostle Paul. And we have to clarify, he didn't say it's wrong to have money. It's not wrong to earn money. It's not even wrong to want money, because we live in a world where that is really the medium of exchange. We have to have some kind of medium of exchange, currency that other people accept in order to buy food and shelter and housing and clothing and so forth and so on. So there's nothing wrong with it. Where it really becomes a problem is that when we begin to think that our identity is wrapped up in that, and our security is wrapped up in that. It's funny because the King James, I love the King James version. Sometimes these old King Jamesian phrases are just classic, where he said, he can't be greedy for filthy lucre. Lucre is not a word we use much, but it refers to basically what we would call sordid or dishonest gain. It's you want it so bad that you'll do anything to get it. You'll lie, you'll cheat, you'll steal, do whatever you can, even kill in some cases, because you want it so bad. And so he says basically it's a very dishonorable way to interact with people, and it's pretty distasteful. It's just really not attractive. And so even in Proverbs, Solomon warns about it. He says when you go to the house of a rich man, keep your appetite intact, because even though he may be encouraging you to eat as much as you want, he probably will keep track of how much you eat and bill you for it later. And they're just, it's interesting, because if you study the biographies of people who have been extremely wealthy, the Rockefellers, the Gettys, and people like that, you realize these people had the Midas touch all right, but they also were incredibly miserably unhappy people. Somebody asked John Paul Getty how much more money he needed, and he said, just one more dollar. Well, he was already the richest man in the world at that time. He was a billionaire, and he just had to have one more dollar. So this is one of the guys that even when his grandson was kidnapped, didn't want to pay the ransom, even though it was easy for him to do. So you just realize that these are people who have become so captured by money, because one of the things that Getty admitted, it wasn't wealth that he liked, it was the power that wealth provided him. If you have enough money, he said, you can control everybody and everything, and that's what he did. He used his money to control people. Well, that's a really, really unhealthy characteristic, especially contrary to what it means to be a Christian. As we talked about earlier in the week, it was Jesus who said it's more blessed to give than it's to receive, that there are people who in this world have become rich. And one of the things that Paul says is it's not sin, but he does caution. He says, for example, in 1 Timothy 6:9, he says, people who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. And it's interesting. He doesn't say someone who becomes successful and because of their success they've gained material prosperity, but he says their whole intention is to get rich. They're doing what they do for only one reason, and that's because they want to be stinking rich. And he said the problem with that is if riches become your goal, you'll find that it's going to take you down pathways that will very potentially destroy you. I heard a story one time. A gentleman said his father had become very successful, and he had so much money that every once in a while he would just put a bunch of money in his pocket and he would just go down the street and drop it. And he said because he wanted to be sure in his mind that the money didn't have a hold on him, but he had a hold on the money. And so you'll find that some people are very, very good financial managers. Some people are called by God. They're given by God what we call a gift of giving. And in order to give, you have to get. And I know some men and women who are, they're really kind of amazing. It seems like every endeavor they go into is successful, but they always really acknowledge that their businesses and their success is God's, and they're very generous, and they're very concerned about not only using that wisely, but also investing it wisely, and not simply as a means of living an exorbitant lifestyle. And that's why Paul went on to say in 1 Timothy 6, later on in the chapter, in verse 17, he says, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share." That played out very practically in the early church, because where did the early church meet? Well, they met in the homes of men and women who had been highly successful. Lydia, who Paul stayed with and became really the center of the first church in Philippi, was a purple merchant. Purple cloth was the most expensive fabric in the world at that time, and it was incredibly expensive. A simple robe would cost in today's dollars like $30,000. And you realize that she was obviously that she was dealing in this, buying low, selling high. And she had amassed probably a significant fortune, and yet what do we find? She is not one who is hoarding it and keeping herself, but she opens her home, and she's providing for food and refreshments, but also facilities. Probably was really in tune with people in the church who had personal needs and were struggling and going through difficult times. I'm sure she even provided funds to help people buy their freedom if that opportunity came up. And basically using her wealth as a way of benefiting others, seeing how she could give it to others. And that's why I think that it's really important that we understand, first of all, that it's not wrong to acquire wealth, but it's also recognizing that if you do, it's a tremendous responsibility. And you didn't become wealthy because you're better, smarter, or more gifted and more talented than other people, but you're given that by God ultimately. And that's a key thing, that regardless of what abilities or you have to be able to do that, most people I find, they say, I have one friend of mine says, I don't even know how I do it. Everything I do just comes up to be profitable. And he was giving away half of his income at that point, because he just was so aware that this was not just his doing, but it was something that God was pouring into his life. And so we need to understand, and I'm not telling you have to give away half your income, but I'm simply saying you need to understand that whatever you received is a gift from the Lord. And I remember when I was a young believer and I had really hardly any money, just barely surviving, and my mom sent me a letter, and in the letter was a $20 bill. And man, I had seen it. In those days, $20 bills was something. And I didn't spend it. I just had it in my wallet, and I carried it with me because I didn't, really want to spend it, because it was a lot of money for me at that point in my life, and I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And then suddenly I encountered a family that was stranded on the side of the road and had no gas and couldn't get to the next place. And God so clearly told me, give them the $20 bill. I would like to say I immediately responded, but I remember just sitting there saying, Lord. And, I finally came to the point of saying, I just have to be obedient and trust God. And so I walked over to the folks and I just said, here, God told me to give you this. And their jaw dropped and they were shocked. They didn't expect that. They especially didn't expect it from a long-haired hippie like me. But I trust and pray that was a testimony to them. They saw a Christian who was doing something that they understood was sacrificial. And I just trust and pray that was part of what led them into a saving experience with Christ. Because all I know is they went and bought some gas and went on with their journey. But these are the kind of things I think we need to understand, that if God doesn't give us a financial increase, then we need to really be praying, so God, when am I supposed to do that? It's something my wife and I have learned over the years, because we've just found that it's easy to get caught up in money. It's easy to just go on a spending spree because you've got extra money. And it really is important that we develop that discipline. We're saying, Lord, Show me how I'm supposed to handle this, how I'm supposed to manage this. And one of the things I will say that my wife and I have found, it is more of a blessing to give. It's just more of a blessing to give than it is to get. Well, we're out of time this week, but look forward to picking up the conversation as we continue on in verse 4 of chapter 3 of 1 Timothy. You might want to read ahead to see what's coming. God bless you and go in His grace.